I'm here with Carey Gillam as part of our book club. And this month's, or one of our books this month, is the Monsanto Papers, which I finished and loved and thought was fantastic. And I can't say enough good things about it as someone who's really invested in this story and this book. And the way that you broke everything down made it so much easier to understand. And the power of almost feeling like you're in the courtroom during this story was really cool. And to get to read things like the deposition with the Monsanto scientist, I was like, oh, I'm so invested in. I thought it was so cool the way that you were able to set the story, and then also, probably because you had interviews with all of these people, get an inside view of what they were thinking during the time. So it was so cohesive. But I just want to hear, why did you write this? What catalyzed this? Let's start with that.
Sure. No, thank you. Thanks for the kind words too about the book. And that was my goal in writing this, the Monsanto Papers, was to tell the story in a way that sucked the reader in and had them experience it much like I did, and how the key players experienced it, because it was such a just remarkable and powerful and dramatic kind of saga that unfolded this first ever trial. Of course, the book documents how this came to be the first ever Roundup cancer trial, right? And the first plaintiff, who is Lee Johnson, who was this impoverished African American, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of guy, father of two boys, homeless at one time, but gets himself up and successful to a degree. He's become a school groundskeeper. He's making enough money to get a nice little house, to rent a nice little house for his family, and feeling proud of it. And then he, has this accident with this tank sprayer of Roundup or Ranger Pro, and is doused in this chemical, and over time develops this just horrendous type of cancer that just caused him so much suffering, and he's told he's going to die. Anyway, I guess I'm going through the whole story, which I don't need to do, but watching Lee, getting to know the lawyers, attending the trial, as I watched all this unfold and I saw kind of the legal twists and turns that happened, and saw Lee's profound suffering, I just thought this should be a movie. I mean, as I was there in the courtroom and there with Lee in his little house, and I just thought this has to be a movie. And of course, I don't know how to make a movie, so I know how to write a book, and that's what I did. And I wanted to tell it in a way that sort of like a legal thriller of sorts. It kind of reads like fiction, but actually is nonfiction. Everything is true. Everything is documented and backed up with court documents and transcripts and interviews and depositions and audio. And so everything in the book is true, but I think it's so crazy dramatic that it's hard to believe some of it is true, I think.
It is super dramatic. When you were in the thick of it, what were some things that you learned that you didn't know? Like, were there things you learned about the legal process that you weren't familiar with, or things you learned watching watching a corporation fight against plaintiffs' lawyers? What were things that really surprised you?
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple different things. I mean, one was definitely the legal process. This whole machine in the US that we call mass torts, where you have, large numbers of people. Some people think of it as a class action. It's a little bit different, but you have thousands of people that have the same sort of case that they want to bring against a company. And in the case of Roundup, it was ultimately over 100,000 people in the US with non-Hodgkin lymphoma suing Monsanto, alleging that their exposures to Roundup, these herbicides sold by Monsanto, caused them to get non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And so what happens in the US is this mass tort. These cases get bound together for discovery, and these lawyers come in and take all these cases with no money up front. So they put millions of dollars into building a case, and they may or may not get anything in the end. They could get great riches in the end, if they win, or they could go bankrupt if they lose. And it's just a fascinating industry, and it's got some scoundrels in it, and one of the lawyers in the book ended up in prison. But it's got some, white knights that really are fighting the good fight, although they might have some some dark sides of themselves. It was just a lot there to learn about mass tort and to try to explain and explore that. And then also with Lee, I mean, just Lee and his family and seeing how he lived and sort of the suffering that cancer patients go through just trying to get through a day and trying to stay alive, and what he was doing to try to be the first man to fight Monsanto in court, at the same time just trying to survive long enough, to spend time with his two young sons. It was just a deeply moving experience for me, and I wanted to try to convey that, to readers.
Mm-hmm. Well, so with the mass torts and the fact that there were so many cases happening, so many plaintiffs, why did they choose Lee as the first case?
Yeah, I mean, it was partly random and partly not. There were a number of people with lawsuits. Lee happened to get, the doctor's report that he had 18 months left to live, just at the time that they were getting ready to pick, who should be the first plaintiff. And, he was right up there, and then he was given that death sentence, essentially. And so they asked the judge for a preference trial, essentially. Let's try to get this man his day in court before he dies. And the judge agreed, and it worked out that he became the first then, in June of 2018, to take Monsanto to trial. It was a historic trial. It was, followed by media around the world, because it was the first time ever that this product that had been on the market since the 1970s, and Monsanto had always said it's so safe. People use it all over in backyards and farm fields and school grounds, parks. So it was a really big deal to say, hey, this looks like it causes cancer.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I was really interested or intrigued by in the book was the way the lawyers on the plaintiff side, how they figured out how to release documents that were classified as confidential by Monsanto. And I won't go into the details because I think people should read about it and understand what happened. But what was that like for you? Was that really, did you learn a lot from that? Did you know that that's how lawyers figure out these loopholes? I mean, it was really interesting to hear the process and then the aftermath.
Yeah, I'm not sure all lawyers, do that. I mean, this was, yeah, you're right. I mean, there was a loophole that this Brent Wisner, one of the lawyers, discovered in the protective order, and he was very bound and determined to get these internal Monsanto secret documents, out into the public. And to me specifically, I mean, I had been trying to get my hands on those documents for a long time. And of course, they, make up a lot of the book. I was able to get those, the release at 12:01 a.m., just after midnight, of the documents. But yeah, I mean, and Brent had to fight his own colleagues, the other attorneys that were on his team, because they thought it was a really dangerous move and it was going to enrage the judge. And of course it did enrage the judge, and Monsanto threw a fit. And it was a big deal. It was very exciting, very dramatic. I was up at 12:01 a.m. getting those documents as soon as they were coming, and getting them out there so people could read them, because they just, what they show, the Monsanto Papers, this is why I wanted to call the book the Monsanto Papers, they just reveal so many long hidden dark secrets about how this company lied to regulators and its own customers, and for so long, about what the science was telling us about the dangers of this chemical. So I thought it was important that the book reflect that in the name, certainly.
Oh, yeah. Well, so another part of the book, I think some people know about this, but not everyone knows the extent of the ghostwriting. Did you know about that before you got these documents?
Well, I did because I had gotten other documents previously, and I wrote about the ghostwriting a little bit in my first book, Whitewash in 2017. But those were just little bits and pieces. And then what came out, in this trial, actually, really was the whole giant enchilada, if you will, the weight of evidence, where you could see how this was not just kind of a one-off, out of context kind of comment or allegation, that this was something that was embedded in Monsanto's scientific process, which was to employ outside scientists, pay them, and have their names on these scientific reports that Monsanto's people would actually write. And they did it to put forward, science that said our product doesn't cause cancer. It's really, really safe. And they did it primarily to give to regulators so that they could keep the product on the market. But these were actually written by Monsanto, even though they look like they were independent. And they talk about ghostwriting in their own documents, and they talk about how important it's going to be to protect and defend their product. So, yeah, that was pretty outrageous stuff.
Yeah, and the way that I read your first book too, and I remember reading about the IARC cancer classification, but I don't know if you mentioned this in the first book, but I didn't remember how Monsanto had strategized prior to that classification coming out, as like, it's so obvious that they know this causes cancer. They're just trying to figure out how to avoid this, just understanding the case, and how all the strategies were just preventative, or like prevention from revealing the truth, which is interesting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Then there was one great example. I say great example, but it's one that just sticks with me of when the company in the late 1990s was so worried about these independent studies that were coming out, and they needed a big, giant paper that was going to refute all the cancer evidence. And they spent, I think if I remember it right, like 3 years working on this paper, this independent paper. And they talk in their own documents about how much time we've spent on this independent paper, writing and editing, and all the different internal Monsanto people who spent time on this independent paper. And then they finally get it out, this independent paper. And so they have a big celebration, inside Monsanto, to celebrate all their hard work on this independent paper that says glyphosate and Roundup are safe. And it's just like the hypocrisy of that, or the hubris, or it's just outrageous.
Yeah. Well, so were you there for the whole trial?
Not for the whole trial. No, it lasted 10 weeks, if I'm thinking right. It started June 18, June 10, June 18-ish, and ended August 10th. And so I was actually in Australia on August 10th, and one of the lawyers was like texting me, as the verdict was being read. And then, of course, everybody called, and then it just was a whole thing. So, but no, I wasn't there in the courtroom. I can't believe I missed that.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about I guess what your experience was like watching or reading, observing Monsanto's scientific experts. Like what did that feel like? Because they were all categorically like, glyphosate does not cause cancer. Do you think they really believed that?
This is something with the science. Well, and first of all, and just as being a reporter, I don't know that I can ever say that I know, right, when someone else is thinking or why they're saying something, unless they tell me, what they're thinking or why they said it. So I don't know, but I do know what I've learned in all these years of writing about this subject matter is that, science and data is not always necessarily, a black and white sort of thing. There's so many different things to take into account, and so many different analyses and different ways to weight things. And And I think this is why, you don't just do one study, right? You do multiple studies, and they look at the weight of evidence, and they do meta-analysis, and they set rules in place. There are scientific rules in place for how to evaluate the data and how to read results like that. So I'm not a scientific expert, but when I talk to independent scientists who are truly independent, who are not being paid by Monsanto, I don't know that I've run into an independent scientist who has ever said that there's no evidence that glyphosate causes cancer. What they've said to me, what many have said, is they're not following the rules. The EPA, when they disregard all these scientific studies that show, carcinogenicity or show risk for carcinogenicity, they're breaking their own rules. The EPA is disregarding international scientific rules for how to read epidemiology results, for instance. And a federal court just agreed with that last summer, not in a Roundup case, but in a regulatory case.
Yeah, that was our case.
Right. That's right. It is you guys, right? And so I should let you talk about that. But it's the science. I should let you say it. It seems like there's a lot of ways that people could look at the science, I guess. So when Monsanto scientists sit up there, are they lying, or are they just taking a different,
interpreting the data,
looking at the data in a way that pleases Monsanto? I don't know.
Yeah, well, so our case, basically the court ruled that EPA didn't follow their own cancer guidelines when deciding whether or not glyphosate was safe.
Right, which is exactly what the scientists told them, in 2016, and the scientific advisory panel meeting that I attended in Washington, D.C. in 2016.
Oh, you were on that panel?
I was there, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I follow around. I traipse around after this stuff all the time.
Oh, I know. You're the expert. If I think of somebody to talk to about what's going on with glyphosate, you would be the first to come to mind.
Which is such a strange thing, right? Like, what possessed you? When they first asked me to write Whitewash, this book about glyphosate, basically, I said, no one's going to read a book about glyphosate. And the fact that I'm one reporter, probably the only reporter in the world who spent this much time writing about glyphosate, makes me a big nerd, but I don't know that it makes me an expert. But yeah, people care, clearly.
Yeah.
It's become a very important topic.
Yeah, well, and I think this book is really powerful if you're someone who is reading a lot and very aware of what's in your food and yada, yada. You know what glyphosate is, but you might feel really discouraged, by the system in general, by the regulatory system, by the food system, by corporate consolidation, et cetera. And you should still feel discouraged. It's still discouraging, but to read through the way that lawyers, tackle this case and to leave with a sense of hope without giving too much away of what happens, it's inspiring. It's encouraging to know that, you can challenge corporations. It is possible.
Yeah, it is. Although you're right. And so much has come out, and it is creating change, and it is opening eyes. And I think because of the revelations in those documents and how they've been illuminated by books and podcasts and your organizations and challenges to the EPA on this sort of thing, it has inspired, here where I live in Overland Park, Kansas, the city leaders are looking right now to remove glyphosate, and that's happening all over the country and all over the world, and sparking more knowledge, I think, and action on pesticides generally, to a degree. But the thing that is really just tragic about it all is that it takes litigation. It takes lawyers, mass tort lawyers, to unearth this evidence. And we see it over and over and over. We're seeing it, you know, with paraquat, we saw it with opioids, we saw it with the tobacco industry, we saw it with, you know, talc and Johnson and Johnson. I mean, the fact that we can't rely on our regulators, that we have to rely on lawyers, you know, who are willing to take these giant cases, that's not a good system in my view.
No, no, it's not.
So,
Well, thank you so much for your time, Carey, and for talking with me about your book. And is there anything that you want to leave people with, or anything you want to say about the book?
if you read the book, be sure you read the all the way to the end, you know, because Lee doesn't die. Should I not say that?
Oh, that's
At least not by the end of the book. And he's got a great little, I don't know, the end of the book, even when I read it, when I wrote it, it made me cry, you know, and even still now when I read it, it makes me cry. So I hope it impacts other people as well, you know, because it is a book about a legal case, but I really think it's a book about people too, and humanity and courage and just a will to live and a will to survive cancer, and survive and be important and a part of your family and part of humanity. So, I mean, that's the main message I guess I hope people see in the book too.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Carey.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me.